session. Very pleased to be with you here today. You're either around lunchtime, like me, in the UK, you're up late in Australia, New Zealand, or into Asia, or getting up very early in North America. But we appreciate you joining us here for the discussion today, where we'll talk about the future of delivery, unleashing the potential of micromobility for the last mile. My name is Graham Pointer, Director Policy here at WSP in the UK, until quite recently in WSP in Australia in a similar role. And I'm joined today by my colleague Lawrence. Welcome, Lawrence.
Yeah, hi everyone. Lawrence Penn, so I work in our Future Mobility team, and I'm joining you today from Move conference in London, where there's a big presence for micromobility and last mile logistics. So I think an exciting time to be talking about future delivery.
Excellent, thanks, Lawrence. As I kick off, I'd like to thank Uber in Australia very much, and the team led by Polly Ipov and Ashley Cormack for the opportunity to work on this project. It's been a really interesting opportunity to explore best practice globally and to assemble our thoughts on the key things that cities need to do to embrace micromobility for the last mile. This is the second Snack and Learn session on this topic. You might have seen colleagues Shafani and Sarah yesterday or this morning, depending where you are in the world, offering a contribution from Sydney and New Zealand, I think they were, for the time of the session, but keen to inject a bit of UK experience into this session as we cover the topic. In terms of housekeeping, there'll be time for questions at the end, so ask you all to add your questions into the questions box of your GoToWebinar control panel during the presentation. On that control panel, you'll be able to find the handouts box, which includes a copy of the presentation as well as report and checklist. You are muted as you joined the presentation, and this is being recorded and will be available publicly afterwards. So without further ado, we'll push into the presentation. In terms of a bit of orientation and our agenda for today, really want to share our takeaways from compiling this analysis and report. I know that it's publicly available, so I won't repeat everything that's in there, of course, but really running over the increasing demand for deliveries, the role that micromobility could play, and then those big moves to take to realise the potential, and then really zeroing in on a case study and things that you can do right now in your cities and towns to test and scale these opportunities. And Lawrence will be providing a very applied example of that. I think something that we can all recognise, certainly over recent time, is the rapid increase in demand for deliveries. And that relates to us as consumers, business to business also, and that's creating a last mile delivery challenge. I think it's a challenge, it's always been there, it's just getting more and more acute. We can see that demand for deliveries of almost everything from ready to eat meals to home improvement items is on the rise, and it's helpful to unpack the rise in deliveries into three key types. So parcel deliveries are the largest market segment, followed by groceries and then food deliveries. But we can see from the numbers on this slide the rapid increase in scale expected over the next few years. And if anything, these represent an underestimate, given most data is based on 2020 forecasts, and I think we've seen rapid increases since then. So the scale is pretty breathtaking. And when we consider our cities and our towns and how they're put together, for the most part, we have many cities that were designed for cars, and with entrenched industry practice as well. That means the majority of deliveries reach their final destination by cars, vans, and trucks, even over short distances. And that's resulted in competition for space and crowding on our roads and streets. So if we take a few numbers on this slide, according to the World Economic Forum, given that current trajectory of increasing deliveries, by 2030, in the top 100 global cities, we'd expect to see a 36% increase in the number of delivery vehicles. And with that comes congestion, increased emissions from delivery traffic by nearly a third. And then at a more local level, it means increased time spent commuting, stuck in traffic, greater carbon emissions, noisy neighbourhoods, congested curbsides, and more traffic-related injuries as we deal with that contest for space. So the crux of our analysis was exploring the role that micromobility can play to move freight in those city and town centres, and what their role is compared to cars, vans, and trucks. And if you did that, what might the opportunities be for those places? But first, what do we mean by micromobility? There's no one set definition out there. So we turned our minds researching globally and then turning our minds to the freight task. And what does that look like in terms of micromobility? And we landed on a definition of people are electric powered, low to moderate speed, lightweight vehicles such as bikes, cargo bikes, trolleys, and drones. Each has a different use case where it can be useful in our cities, and it's something that we can explore together as we go through this presentation. So micromobility vehicles can have a competitive advantage over cars, trucks, and vans in those busy and dense city centres where space is at a premium, parking is at a premium, and where speed is at a premium as well. So the success of micromobility in each use case will depend to a large degree on that city's density, the urban form, the operating environment, the size and type of delivery, operator willingness to explore different options, proximity to customers. But we're pretty confident that when these ingredients, and the experience has shown, that when these ingredients come together, the last mile freight task is ripe for disruption to create better outcomes for cities and improved efficiencies for businesses. So listed on the screen there are a few of those opportunities that you see if you replace cars, vans, trucks and that competition for space through adopting micromobility. Number one on the list, it's in no priority order, but number one is in terms of supporting Vision Zero. So improving safety for people that interact in our places and transport networks. And that focus on place comes through. There's also, of course, an economic edge to it as well, and the efficiency for businesses to get their deliveries done more efficiently and more quickly, which is what we're finding to be the case through the adoption of micromobility, particularly in those congested environments. And also the creation of different business models, looking at a competitive advantage for those businesses, playing on the greener, quicker angle for micromobility. So what do city leaders need to do to unleash the potential of micromobility for those last mile deliveries? So we, as part of this analysis, we looked around at cities globally, leaned into WSP's network of experts, and I'd like to thank all the collaboration and expertise from colleagues and out into industry as well, to identify the 5 big moves for public and private sector leaders. And important to emphasise that this is through a public and private collaboration to make these things happen. We identified 5 big moves to take. And important to note that those 5 big moves are not equal. We see some as fundamental to creating the right operating environment, while others are an opportunity to accelerate the transition towards last mile deliveries. So if we look at those fundamental big moves to creating the right operating environment for deliveries by micromobility, Number one we've highlighted is safe moving. If it's safe for people to move around by micromobility, they're more likely to do it. And you can see that in terms of the measures that cities are taking to make it safer to move around. Of course, there's an infrastructure piece there when we think about protected cycleways and the like, but increasingly, of course, regulation. So when we think about vehicle speeds, really slowing down the traffic in an environment makes it that much easier to get around. And then, of course, the behaviour change, cultural aspects, the glue around that to educate users of the transport system to move around safely. Number two is easy PUDO. This won't be the last time you hear that term PUDO. It's increasingly important to think about how we pick up and drop off our deliveries. So all well and good moving safely, but then if there aren't safe and convenient opportunities at the origin of a trip and the destination, then deliveries won't happen. And there's something really interesting here, because I think traditionally we've thought about this in terms of the reallocation of road space and pavement and public space, but increasingly, as particularly deliveries to private dwellings or complexes increase, it becomes an increasing requirement on those private facilities, providing opportunities to pick up, drop off in an easy way. And also, of course, education around that. Where to do it safely, how to do it safely, where to do it more conveniently. And the third big move we think is incredibly important is for cities to set that long-term policy direction. That really creates the enabling environment to support a transition to micromobility for those last mile deliveries. So if a city has a Vision Zero strategy in place and is implementing it to bring fatalities and injuries down to zero, if they're focused on a net zero transition, and if they're taking an integrated approach to land use and transport considerations, then you've got the right ingredients there to springboard into embracing micromobility for the last mile. And so once you've got those three in place, how do you then really accelerate the transition towards last mile deliveries? We think remoding, so that's transitioning deliveries from cars, vans and trucks to micromobility for the last mile, becomes really important through micro consolidation centres. And so there's a role for operators to play in that, of course, because I think it's most effective when it's business led. Governments can help the transition as well through availability of space and the like, and then property owners too, in terms of promoting sites for that engagement. And then a big one as well that we're seeing globally, and a lot of great practice in the UK and through Europe, is testing ideas to promote last mile deliveries and to see what works and then scaling it up. Lighter, quicker, cheaper approaches. Nimble policy and regulation becomes a vital intervention to enable this. And then innovation and collaboration across stakeholders, public and private, becomes crucial. So detailed in the report, and we don't have time to go through a lot of these now, are some examples from around the globe of cities implementing these big moves. And these were case studies selected by WSP's global experts. It's fair to say that no single city has nailed it yet in terms of embracing deliveries by micromobility, but we've got so many useful insights into what is possible. So Utrecht, providing an example of our first big move, safe moving, has an extensive network of safe moving infrastructure and the regulatory changes that discourage delivery cars, vans, trucks from their city centres. There's a high adoption rate in terms of vehicles per household, 98% of households with a bike, 2.9 bikes per household, and tellingly 60% of trips into the city centre are made by bike. Paris probably provides one of the most complete examples that we explored, and they, in terms of that reallocation of road space and regulation to slow down speeds and limit access to cars, vans, and trucks, sets the scene to enable easy Pluto for their centres. Bogota, in terms of policy action, accelerating central London's embracement of consolidated micro logistics hubs has been really powerful. One business model found that through transitioning to micromobility brought a 52% reduction in kilometres travelled per parcel, 88% reduction in CO2 emissions, and 29% reduction in overall costs compared to previous delivery setups. And we've certainly seen in New York some real opportunities testing corrals for cargo bikes and trials and really reallocation of space to really test opportunities, and they're detailed in the report. I think, so reflecting in terms of putting this presentation together and what would be useful in the short time we have together, looking at those 5 big moves, I think in terms of the UK and Europe in particular, the fundamentals are really pushing the scale and really getting there, to the point that we're seeing a whole bunch of innovation when it comes to test and scale those operations. So we wanted to concentrate on that for just a few minutes to provide the experience that Lawrence is championing in a trial in the UK. Over to you, Lawrence.
Thanks, Graham. Yeah, so I want to spend a little bit of time just talking about some of the trials that we've got in development, which are looking at really identifying some of the key use cases where e-cargo bikes are most successful. I think we know that they're not a complete solution, so it's important to test them where we think they're going to be most effective and have the greatest impact. Yeah, next slide, please. So we are working with the West of England Combined Authority as part of their Future Transport Zone to trial lots of different types of freight innovations, but we're really beginning with the e-cargo bikes. So as you can see, our trials have already started to gain a bit of media attention, featured on BBC News recently, but the use cases we're looking at mostly focus on campus logistics, as we believe these trials to be quite repeatable, so we can export our findings elsewhere across the country. But they're doing all sorts of different activities. So at hospitals, they're delivering PPE between the different buildings, as well as the delivering equipment to theatres, and then some of the more general moving IT equipment around. And then for universities, we've also got them doing grounds maintenance activities. So not just delivery, but also servicing. Next slide, please. So all of our trials are supported by a detailed monitoring and evaluation strategy, and that's really what makes our trials a bit more unique. So we're really diving into the detail of all the different metrics in which e-cargo bikes might be more successful than vans. So we're installing all of them with GPS trackers as well as the vans, so that we can do a bit of a before and after and during to understand where e-cargo bikes are replacing van trips. So more of a sort of naturalistic study, I suppose. And then to capture the qualitative side, we've also got activity logs, which will capture the driver's opinions, particularly picking up on some of those seasonal impacts. Clearly a very different experience using an e-cargo bike through the winter compared to the summer. And to support that too, we've also got interviews, and each trial's got a working group which feed into a sort of overarching working group where we can share findings as and when they emerge, particularly where we've got similar use cases across the different trialling organisations. Next slide. So some of the lessons we've learned so far, I think it's fair to say that the e-cargo bike market is still maturing, and so they don't always hold up to the same abuse as regular bikes might do. The construction standards aren't quite there yet. But we're finding with funding and extra support, and also putting a bit more focus on the sort of maintenance and servicing package that we offer to our trial participants, we find that should keep them on the road. Similarly, lead times of production, loads of supply chain issues at the moment, also afflicting the automotive sector, so your microprocessor and your battery shortages. Infrastructure barriers too, where the cycling infrastructure is lacking or where there's barriers to prevent motorcycles accessing, that all erodes the competitive journey time advantage that e-cargo bikes can have over vans. So I think there's a wider question here about how can we make the network accommodate these larger cycles. Next slide, please. And then quickly, some of the key enablers for the popularization of e-cargo bikes. I think financial support, perhaps an obvious one, but for new entrants to the market starting small, the capital cost can be quite significant. So anything that the public sector can do to help sort of grease the wheels is really going to help get things moving. Space for logistics too, finding appropriate real estate to support micro consolidation in particular, that's on the key route network, but also with good access to the bike network is becoming quite a challenge. But I think more generally, public knowledge is important. Help get e-cargo bikes and push them towards ubiquity. And more people know about them, the more people might consider them. And I think that's when we'll start to see the real growth. Next slide. So finally, how to test and scale. So I think first of all, through trialing, it's about understanding the role for micromobility. As I mentioned at the start, they're not a complete solution. So where do they work best? And then let's really focus on those use cases. And then we need to spot where those use cases might be implemented. So identifying the problem. And I think it is important to solve real problems and not just test them for the sake of it. Otherwise, they won't bring all the benefits that you're expecting. And when working with trialing partners, it's really important to work with willing and enthusiastic people because I think it is quite a significant undertaking, particularly for smaller businesses. And I think they've got to really be involved in order to have the confidence that they're going to make the trial work. And then finally, moving on to monitoring and evaluation, I mentioned the monitoring and evaluation strategy that we've got in place to understand across a range of different metrics, including things like the number of parking fines that you pick up. They all add up to paint that bigger picture of the effectiveness of the intervention. And of course, as you learn findings, it's important to share them so that other people can benefit from them too.
Excellent. Thanks, Lawrence. Just before we move into Q&A, just a few key takeaways that we wanted to leave with you as you go back to the desk or wherever you call work to think about how to apply this. And our key takeaways are the rising demand for deliveries is outgrowing infrastructure. Do nothing really isn't an option. Micromobility can contribute to the broader strategies and goals of cities to carbonise, to improve safety through Vision Zero initiatives, and also in terms of shifting the focus back to people and places. Success of adopting micromobility for last mile really depends on collaboration and public and private working together, focusing on those big moves. And really keen for this analysis and research to be applicable in your situations. So using those big moves checklists in terms of the types of measures or interventions that you'd expect to see under each is a ready reckoner in terms of the maturity of your area to be adopting micromobility for the last mile, and hope that resource is useful to you, for you. So Lawrence, we have a few questions that have come through. So we'll just get straight onto those. And I thought you might like this first one, Lawrence, which is, how do you avoid clashes of recreational users and micromobility users in the same space? So those mix of uses and priorities.
I think that's really a question around infrastructure. So e-cargo bikes clearly being much larger, they're going to take up a bit more room on the cycle paths. So I think when we're designing these schemes, it's important to consider the extra space that might be needed, but also turning space where we're talking about e-cargo bike loading bays or where they might be locked up. I think the micro planning aspects will also be key to enabling the future of delivery.
Excellent, thanks, Lawrence. Really interesting one here around how does last mile delivery modes, or how do last mile delivery modes impact the allocation of real estate for logistics? We've probably both got something to say about this. Would you like to start, Lawrence?
Yeah, I mean, we mentioned the provision of appropriate sort of light industrial units that are suitable for micro consolidation activities. So the location is clearly important, so linking up with the key route network and also the cycle network, but also thinking about providing a degree of flexibility to the operators. So both in terms of the contract length, so it's got to be long enough that they can become well established and test out their sort of commercial model, but also with perhaps cancellation clauses or a short enough tenure that would allow people to change location if they find that that initial location isn't working for them without sort of wiping them out. But I think the final thing to say is also scalability. So I know some people even operate out of shipping containers. They're secure, flexible, but you can also add more easily if you find that the market is really taking off, and that allows you to respond really quickly to demand, which we're expecting to grow quite quickly.
Yeah, thanks, Lawrence. I'm glad this question was asked because it's something I'd like to dwell on for a little bit, just because I thought as a geographer, policy maker, I thought this really reconceptualizing the built environment becomes really interesting when we consider the push towards micromobility, because it is about the allocation, that pure view of logistics in terms of distribution center, then away we go, becomes a little bit more fluid. So Lawrence has talked there about more opportunistic areas of space, but if we consider this here to stay, there are those hubs that we need within dense environments or on the outskirts of dense environments, but there's an increasing consideration about the destination. So within new schemes that come, it still becomes a logistical requirement to get it to the front door, to get that door-to-door journey for goods, and how does that last leg happen? And so increasingly through retrofitting of existing residential areas or where businesses are co-located, where does that interchange happen, and what is the real estate requirement for that? So I think in terms of amending the design of how we conceptualize things, it's not something that can be fully absorbed in the public realm, is my view, and it's something that needs to be designed into space to service people's and businesses' needs. So there's a few things to unpack on that one, but really interesting. Okay, let's have a look through another question. We have another question around how sophisticated statistically is your projection of growth in delivery demand? I'd point you to the sources that we provided in the report. We've relied on sources that industry relies upon to consider the scale of their operations. But certainly I'd direct you to the report and the links in the in the back to consider how happy you are with the veracity of those sources. But we were quite comfortable with them. If I look further into the questions and suggest one for you, Lawrence. One from Australia is that councils are terrified about issues of liability when you mention e-scooter trials in their LGA. I think that if we substitute e-scooter trials for the other, like different forms of mobility, I don't know, what would you say to those councils, Lawrence?
I think it's about comparative advantages. So people are always worried when you bring a new mode into the mix because it's unfamiliar. People don't necessarily know straight away how they're going to interact with it, particularly if they're sharing pedestrian space and cycle paths with them, etc. But I think for every van that we're taking off the road, there's going to be a definite benefit. I'd much rather be interacting in particularly pedestrian areas with a e-cargo bike going no more than 15 mile an hour than a big diesel van with lots of different blind spots, potentially traveling much faster. So I think, it's remembering what we're replacing.
Yeah, I think it is the fear of the other. It's something we're not used to. I do think, but I think where we need to get our ducks in a row is considering what it looks like at the beginning and the end of the trip. Because I think a cargo bike moving along or an e-scooter moving along a roadway isn't so different to a bike really. But then what's the storage look like, and what's that allocation of the public realm to where to service the business or to service the residential address becomes quite interesting, and it's quite contested space at the curbside. So it requires the leadership, I think, from councils and those decision makers to embrace those different modes and to consider what the vision is for those places and how to best allocate space and flexible use of that space to enable it. And we're seeing lots of examples of that globally, which are highlighted in the report. I'm mindful that we're over time. There's a couple of questions we didn't get to, but we'll get back in touch with the people that sent those, and very much appreciate you sending those to us. And thanks for taking time out of your day to be with myself and Lawrence to go through this presentation. Just a reminder that the report and materials and this presentation are available in the handout box of the GoToWebinar platform. A recording of this presentation will be available to you. I think we'll be emailing a link, otherwise you'll find it on YouTube on the WSP page. Once again, a great thanks to Uber for commissioning this research. We had a blast working on it, such a timely issue to consider. If there's anything else you'd like to pick up on this report or want to discuss the issues, please reach out to myself or Lawrence. We're on LinkedIn. Email is on screen. And wish you well for the rest of the day. Thank you.